The fig is not a fruit. This statement needs immediate clarification because it is precisely the opposite of what everyday experience suggests. What we call a fig is a syconium, a fleshy, closed pouch containing hundreds of tiny flowers inside. When you bite into a fig and find the inside full of tiny seeds surrounded by sweet, creamy pulp, you are eating the plant's flowers, not the fruit in any conventional botanical sense. The skin your fingers touch is the expanded floral receptacle. The sweetness you taste is the nectar of flowers that have never seen the sunlight. The fig is, in strictly botanical terms, an inverted inflorescence that has evolved inward instead of outward. It hid its flowers from the outside world for reasons having to do with one of the oldest biological relationships in existence: the internal morphology of the fig. The arrangement of the flowers inside the pouch is one of the most complex structures in the plant kingdom. A mature syconium typically contains between 100 and 400 tiny flowers distributed on the inner wall of the pouch. These flowers are of three types: the long-styled female flowers, whose ovary will be fertilized by the wasp's pollen and produce a seed; the short-styled female flowers, whose ovary the wasp will use to lay its eggs, but which will not produce a viable seed because the style is too short for the ovule to be fertilized; and the male flowers near the ostiole, which mature when the female wasps are ready to leave and cover them in pollen. This organization is a precision trap. The plant tricks the wasp into laying its eggs in flowers that will not produce seeds, while the flowers that will produce seeds receive pollen without the wasp getting anything from them. This asymmetry in the relationship, where the plant cheats the wasp in part of the transaction, is what evolutionary biologists call a conflict of interest within mutualism. The fig tree and the wasp need each other, but their interests do not perfectly align. The wasp would prefer all the syconium's ovaries to be available for laying its eggs. The fig tree would prefer no ovary to be used for eggs and all to be fertilized to produce seeds. The compromise evolution has reached is the result of tens of millions of years of selection. It favored plants with enough flowers to reproduce and wasps with enough flowers to lay their eggs. It is a biological negotiation that has been happening longer than any human institution. For those hidden flowers to be pollinated, for the fig to produce viable seeds, it needs the intervention of a specific animal that can enter that closed space. The fig has an ostiole at its apical end, a tiny opening barely visible to the naked eye that connects the inside of the pouch with the outside. The fig wasp enters through that opening. Not just any wasp, but the specific wasp that co-evolved for tens of millions of years with the specific species of fig in question. There are more than 750 species of wild fig trees in the world. Each of them has its own dedicated wasp species. The relationship between the fig tree and the wasp is one-to-one, exclusive, and mutually dependent. Without the wasp, the fig tree cannot reproduce through seeds. Without the fig tree, the wasp cannot reproduce at all. What happens when the adult female wasp, covered in pollen from the syconium where she was born, finds a new mature fig and enters through the ostiole is one of the most dramatic biological sequences in existence. The ostiole is so narrow that the wasp loses her wings and antennae as she passes through. She enters with no possibility of leaving. Inside the syconium, she finds the hundreds of flowers and pollinates them while depositing her eggs in the floral ovaries, the fig tree intended for that purpose. Then she dies. The male wasps that hatch from those eggs are blind and wingless. They live for a few hours. During that time, they fertilize the females that have not yet hatched, dig exit tunnels through the fig's wall, and die without ever having left. The females emerge, load themselves with pollen from the male fig flowers that are mature at that time, leave through the tunnels the males dug, and fly away to another fig, where they will repeat the cycle. The fig tree digests the wasp that died inside it. It has specific enzymes for this. In the figs you eat, there are no recognizable remains left. The digestion is complete. What remains is the fig, its pollinated flowers, and its seeds. The relationship between the fig tree and the wasp is not simply mutualism. It is a dependency so deep and ancient that biologists have struggled to decide where one species ends and the other begins. In 75 million years of coevolution, the fig tree and the wasp have shaped each other to the point that each has built part of its biology around the other's needs. 75 million years is a number you have to stop and grasp. We humans have been on Earth for about 300,000 years as a species. Agricultural civilization is about 12,000 years old. Rome, in its longest form, lasted less than 1,000 years. Non-avian dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago. The fig tree and its wasp have been cooperating since before the comet that killed the dinosaurs hit the Earth. They have survived the Cretaceous mass extinction, the Pleistocene glaciations, and the appearance of Homo sapiens. They are, in terms of documented biological relationships, one of the most enduring alliances in the history of life on this planet. This longevity has an evolutionary explanation: the exclusivity of the relationship. Each fig tree species, with its own wasp species, creates an extraordinarily intense selection pressure on both parties. If a wasp species disappears, the associated fig tree species cannot reproduce by seed and enters a path of decline. If the fig tree species disappears, the associated wasp has nowhere to reproduce and goes extinct. The survival of each depends on the survival of the other. This interdependence forces such tight reproductive synchronization that biologists studying the system have observed chemical signals the fig tree emits to coordinate the ripening moments of its syconia with the wasp's reproductive cycle. The fig tree, in a sense, calls the wasp, and the wasp responds. The diversity of the Moraceae family, the botanical family that includes fig trees, reflects the longevity of this relationship. The edible fig, Ficus carica, is just one of more than 800 ficus species distributed throughout the planet's tropics and subtropics. The rubber tree, Ficus elastica, which 10th century Europeans learned to exploit to produce latex, is a ficus. The sacred banyan trees of India, under which the Buddha meditated, are ficus. The Bengal fig tree, whose aerial roots form columns that turn a single tree into what appears to be an entire forest, is a ficus. The family has produced a variety of forms and adaptations unmatched by any other plant genus of comparable size, and that variety is the result of 75 million years of coevolution with its wasps. In the year 2006, a team of Israeli and American archaeologists published a finding in the journal Science that changed the history of agriculture. In Gilgal 1, about 12 kilometers north of Jericho, they had found 9 carbonized figs and 3 fragments among the remains of a pre-pottery Neolithic house. From about 11,400 years ago, the figs themselves were not a revelation. Humans had been eating wild figs long before. The revelation was in the morphology of the figs found. Wild figs produce hard, viable seeds necessary for their reproduction in the absence of human intervention. The figs from Gilgal 1 had no viable seeds. They were parthenocarpic, producing fruit without fertilization of the flowers, a mutation that occurs naturally in the fig tree, but which in nature is an evolutionary dead end because these trees cannot reproduce by seed. A tree with this mutation dies without leaving descendants, unless a human takes cuttings from its branches and plants them. The presence of parthenocarpic figs in Gilgal 11,000 years ago means that someone chose that tree for its softer, sweeter, seedless fruit, and decided to propagate it by cutting branches and planting them. Someone cultivated the first garden. This decision predated the domestication of wheat and barley in the same geographical region by at least 1,000 years. The traditional narrative of the agricultural revolution maintained that cereals, wheat, barley, and rye were the first plants cultivated by humans, and that agriculture began with cereals. The Gilgal 1 fig suggests that domestication began before cereals with a fruit tree. The initial impulse was not necessarily the search for basic calories. but the desire to perpetuate something exceptional that someone had found in nature. Someone tasted a parthenocarpic fig, noticed it was different and better than the figs they knew, and did something completely new. They decided to preserve it forever. The implication of this finding for the history of agriculture cannot be underestimated. The domestication of a plant is not simply starting to eat it. It is identifying desirable traits, selecting individuals that possess them, and intentionally reproducing them so that those traits persist and expand. With cereals, domestication could have occurred almost accidentally. Humans harvesting wild wheat unconsciously selected the varieties with grains that did not disperse on their own, because those were the ones left on the plant at harvest time. The domestication of the fig could not have occurred accidentally. It required the conscious identification of a trait, the absence of hard seeds, and the deliberate action of propagating the tree that had it. The first farmer in history we can identify with certainty was a fig cultivator. The fig has a status written in the biblical text that no other plant shares. It is the first plant species specifically named in Genesis. Before Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, which the biblical text does not identify as an apple. That identification is medieval. There are already fig trees in the Garden of Eden. After eating the fruit, the first thing Adam and Eve do is sew fig leaves together to cover themselves. The fig tree provides humanity's first clothing in the biblical account. It is also the tree under which Nathanael was praying when Philip called him to go see Jesus. And the fig tree instantly withered by Jesus is one of the most discussed miracles in the Gospels. This dense presence of the fig in the sacred texts of Judaism is no coincidence or literary elaboration. It is the reflection of the region's economic and ecological reality. In the Levant and throughout the Eastern Mediterranean basin, the fig was, during the period when the biblical texts were written, a staple food as fundamental as wheat or olive oil. The triad that appears repeatedly in Deuteronomy, wheat, olive oil, and wine, should actually be a tetrad, because figs were equally central. The biblical texts use the abundance of fig trees and vines as an image of prosperity and peace. Sitting under one's own fig tree and vine is the image of the ideal life in the prophets. Desolation is described as the abandonment of fig trees to drought and locusts. Dried figs were, in the economy of ancient Israel and Judah, a form of transportable and storable wealth that the biblical texts record as currency for provisions and gifts. The gift Abigail brought to David to calm his anger included 200 dried figs. David's horsemen, pursuing the Syrians, found an abandoned Egyptian slave who had not eaten in 3 days and gave him bread, water, and a cake of pressed figs, which could be kept for years, and were the most practical and nutritious way to transport energy in the ancient world before the invention of canned goods. The fig tradition in Egypt has a depth that Greek and Roman texts, which tend to situate the origin of civilization on their own shores, do not always acknowledge. Egyptian predynastic period sites contain fig remains, showing that the fruit was already an important cultivated food in the Nile Valley millennia before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Tomb paintings from the Old Kingdom, from the 3rd to the 6th dynasty, include representations of fig trees in funerary gardens and fig harvesting scenes that show the tree as part of the ideal agricultural landscape. The rations of the workers who built the pyramids are documented in administrative papyri in detail. The fig appears in those rations, along with bread, onions, and beer. The provision of figs to the Giza workers was not a luxury. It was part of the basic caloric calculation that the pharaonic administrators made to ensure the workers could keep working. The fig was, in that equation, a source of relatively fast-absorbing sugars that complemented the slower protein content of wheat or barley bread. Mummies from the pharaonic period have provided additional evidence of the fig's centrality in the Egyptian diet. Several burials of individuals of different social ranks, not just pharaohs, but also middle-class people, include dried figs as funerary offerings. The presence of figs in the tombs reflects both their economic value and their symbolic association with provision in the afterlife. Hathor, the goddess of love, fertility, and joy, was represented in some contexts as a fig tree offering its fruits to the dead. The image of the goddess as a nurturing tree is not exclusive to the fig, but the fig was one of the preferred trees for that representation, precisely because its sweetness and abundance made it a natural image of divine providence. In Roman mythology, the fig tree occupies a place unparalleled in any other classical culture. The tree under which the she-wolf suckled Romulus and Remus, the founder and his twin, the pair who gave rise to Rome, was a fig tree. It was called the Ficus ruminalis, and the most accepted explanation for the epithet is that ruminalis derived from ruma, which in archaic Latin meant nipple or breast. It was the tree of foundational nourishment, the tree that made it possible for the founders to survive childhood and build the city. The Ficus ruminalis was not just a mythical tree, it physically existed in Rome. It was located at the foot of the Palatine Hill next to the Lupercal, the sacred cave associated with the she-wolf episode. Pliny the Elder mentions the tree in his Natural History with a topographical precision, suggesting it existed in his time, or at least that there was a tree claiming to be the original. When the tree died, according to chroniclers, it was considered an omen of disaster. It was replanted or replaced several times throughout Rome's republican and imperial history because the survival of the Ficus ruminalis was identified with the survival of the city. Cato the Censor, who wrote De Agricultura in the 2nd century before Christ, the oldest surviving manual of agriculture in Latin prose, dedicates detailed sections to fig cultivation. Cato was a man of severe character and intensely conservative principles who believed that Roman virtue resided in agriculture and working the land. That he dedicated such detailed attention to the fig in his manual is no curiosity. It reflects the central importance the fig had in the agricultural economy of Latium and central Italy in his time. Cato describes varieties, pruning techniques, preservation methods, and ways to use dried figs as food for slaves during the winter months. The most dramatic scene starring a fig in Roman history involves Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus during the Senate debate on whether to destroy Carthage in the year 149 before Christ. The debate had been going on for decades. Cato had been repeating at the end of every speech, whatever its subject, that Carthage must be destroyed. Those opposing the war argued that Carthage was too far away to represent an immediate danger. Scipio at that moment took out a fresh and perfectly ripe fig and showed it to the Senate. He asked when the senators thought that fig had been picked. The senators estimated 3 or 4 days earlier, which was the usual shelf life of a fresh fig. He informed them that this fig had been picked in Carthage the day before. The city they wanted to consider distant was a 3-day boat ride away. The Senate voted for war. Carthage was destroyed. A fig did what Cato's speeches had failed to do in decades. Greece had a relationship with the fig that combined economic utility with cultural symbolism in a way the Greeks applied to few foods. Attica, the region with Athens as its capital, produced figs considered the best in the Mediterranean world in classical times. This reputation was so consolidated and commercially valuable that Solon, the lawmaker, who reformed the Athenian political and legal system in the 6th century before Christ, legislated specifically on figs. One of his laws banned the export of Attic figs outside of Athens. Good figs were to stay for the Athenians. The linguistic consequence of this law is one of the most unexpected in the history of words. The people who reported those trying to smuggle figs out, or who reported fig tree owners attempting to hide their production to avoid export taxes, were called sycophantai in Greek. The word combines fig with phanein, to show or reveal. The sycophant was literally the one who shows the fig, the one who informs on the illegal fig exporter. The word passed into Latin as sycophanta, meaning informer and servile flatterer, and from there to the rest of the European languages. Sycophant in Spanish, sycophant in English. sycophanty in French. Words designating someone who servilely flatters power. They have at their root the first commercial regulation on the fig of which we have written record. Aristotle and Theophrastus observed and described the relationship between the cultivated and wild fig tree with a precision that no one in Western history would equal until the 10th century. Theophrastus, in his History of Plants, describes caprification, hanging wild fig branches over cultivated trees during the ripening of the fruits. The farmers who practiced this technique did not know why it worked. They observed that it worked. The figs of the trees where the wild branches were hung ripened better and fell off less prematurely. That was enough for the practice to be passed down from generation to generation. Theophrastus didn't know why it worked either. He described it with precision and honesty as an observed phenomenon whose cause he did not know. What was happening in caprification, although no one would understand it until the 10th century, was the transfer of wasps. The wild fig branches hung over the cultivated trees contained mature syconia full of female wasps. When these wasps emerged from the wild figs, they found the cultivated figs within their reach and entered them carrying the pollen. Caprification was, unknowingly, a pollinating insect management technique 2,000 years old. Before the concept of a pollinating insect existed in any known scientific tradition, Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, catalogued 29 different varieties of figs available in the Roman market of the 1st century of our era. He describes them in such detail that allows some of them to be identified as varieties that still exist. He distinguishes them by color: white, golden, black, purple; by texture; by ripening season; by geographical origin; by suitability for fresh consumption or preservation. This diversity of varieties is evidence of centuries or millennia of human selection on the fig in the Mediterranean basin. Roman farmers did not simply cultivate fig trees. They cultivated specific varieties for specific purposes, with the same differentiation that winemakers applied to grapes. Islam placed the fig in a theological place, unequaled among fruits in any other monotheistic tradition. Surah 95 of the Quran is called At-Tin, the fig. It begins with an oath by the fig and the olive. In Islamic tradition, oaths in the Quran rest upon things of sacred importance. The fig occupies the first place in this oath. Before the olive, before Mount Sinai, before the secure city. Quranic commentators have debated for centuries what exactly that oath means. Some argue that the fig is a reference to Damascus or the Syrian region. Others, that it is the tree under which Adam received his first revelation. Others simply that the fig is the symbol of divine grace. A hadith attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, transmitted in several collections but considered of variable authenticity, says, "If a fruit had descended from paradise, I would say it is the fig." This statement, whether historically attributable to the Prophet or not, reflects the valuation of the fig in pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabic culture. The fig was in Arabia and the Levant, a first-rate everyday food cultivated in domestic gardens of the region for millennia, associated with divine provision and sweetness as an image of the good. The dried figs that pilgrims carried with them on the journey to Mecca were a form of emergency food that also had spiritual connotations. The relationship between the medieval Arab and Islamic world and fig cultivation also produced important agronomic development that the history of agriculture does not always highlight. The Andalusian agricultural treatises of the 10th and 11th centuries include extensive sections on fig cultivation in the different climatic conditions of the Iberian Peninsula. The agronomists of Al-Andalus, like Ibn al-Awwam, compiled Greco-Roman, Arabic, and local Iberian knowledge. Their syntheses identified fig varieties, caprification techniques, pruning methods, and irrigation systems with a precision unparalleled in European agricultural texts of the following centuries. The fig tree of Al-Andalus was the focus of an intellectual tradition that took agriculture as an object of systematic reflection. The fig was also the first object of a documented commercial conflict between the empires of antiquity. In the 5th century before Christ, the Megarian decrees included a ban on Megarian products in Athenian markets and empire ports. Among those products were Megarian figs. Aristophanes, the Athenian comedy playwright, mentions the Megarian decrees in his comedy, The Acarnanians, in 425 before Christ, where a peasant complains he cannot sell his figs in Athens because of the sanctions. The fig, which the Greeks considered a staple food, was also an object of foreign policy and economic warfare. This episode has a dimension that historians often underline. The Megarian decrees are the first documented economic sanction in Western history. The fig was one of the first products affected by commercial sanctions. The connection between the fig and politics runs from Solon to Pericles, and from there to Scipio in the Roman Senate. The fig, for the Greeks and Romans, was not merely food. It was also an argument. The second city of the global dried fig trade, after the Levantine markets, was Smyrna, on the Aegean coast of what is today Turkey. During the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, Smyrna was the most active port in the Ottoman Empire for the trade of agricultural and natural products, and the dried fig was its most characteristic export. The Smyrna fig, cultivated in the inland valleys of the Turkish Aegean, collected, sorted, and dried using specific techniques, was recognized in all European markets as the reference fig. Sellers wanting to describe the best fig available called it the Smyrna fig. The trade had its chain of actors: the farmers of the Gediz and Buyuk Menderes valleys, the drying facilities with techniques passed down from generation to generation, and the European importers, Venetian, Genoese, English, Dutch, who distributed them in their markets. This chain existed without significant interruption from medieval times, until 19th century transportation technology transformed it. The Smyrna variety belongs to the group of figs requiring caprification to bear fruit, without the presence of the Blastophagacenes wasp, the specific wasp of the common fig. The fruits of the Smyrna varieties fall from the trees before ripening. The farmers of the Aegean valleys practiced caprification as naturally as their Greek and Roman ancestors had practiced it without knowing why it worked. And without needing to know, the knowledge was oral, local, and absolutely effective. The importance of the fig as a staple food for 2 millennia is reflected in a fact that historians frequently cite. The sailors of the Athenian fleet in the 5th century before Christ carried figs in their standard rations. The hoplites marching on land campaigns carried figs. The slaves, working in the Laurian silver mines, received figs as part of their diet. The athletes competing in the ancient Olympic Games, whose diet is described in contemporary sources, included figs in their nutritional regimen. The fig was the ancient equivalent of the modern energy bar, a concentrate of calories, sugars, and minerals in a lightweight, transportable, and durable format. This versatility as a subsistence food coexisted with its presence in the most elaborate banquets. In Roman cuisine of the 1st and 2nd centuries of our era, fresh and dried figs appear in recipes covering the entire food spectrum, from the first appetizers to desserts. Apicius, the recipe compiler we have already discussed in the context of salmon and truffles, includes preparations with figs, combining them with pepper, spiced wine, honey, and meat jellies. The same food the slave ate as a daily ration appeared transformed by technique and secondary ingredients on the patrician banquet table. This dual presence of the fig across all Roman social strata is rare among ancient foods, which typically had marked class identities. The diversity of Ficus carica varieties that humans have selected over millennia is, alongside the grape and the apple tree, one of the most extensive in the plant kingdom. The catalogue of historical varieties includes completely lost types and types that have survived in rural Mediterranean gardens. Current DNA analyses can trace their genetic continuity back to the varieties the Romans cultivated. Green-skinned varieties. The Brava fig of Spain, the Cadota of Italy, the white Marseille of France, are types appearing in classical and medieval sources under different names, but with recognizable physical characteristics. Black or purple skin varieties have a history no less long. This varietal continuity has a biological explanation. The fig tree is easily propagated by cuttings. A branch planted in moist soil produces roots in a few weeks and a productive tree in 3 years. This ease of vegetative propagation is what allowed the first farmer of Gilgal to reproduce his parthenocarpic tree, and it is what has allowed the varieties selected by the Greeks and Romans to survive to this day, without having reproduced by seed. Each tree of an ancient variety is, in genetic terms, a clone of the tree someone propagated centuries or millennia ago. The fig tree has, in the ease of its vegetative propagation, one of the most elegant survival mechanisms human selection has taken advantage of in any crop. The technique of preserving dried figs, pressing them into cakes or compact layers that excluded air and hindered the development of mold, was known in the Mediterranean since the Bronze Age. The archaeological fig cakes from Crete and the Levant from the 2nd millennium before Christ are identical in method to those Cato described and to those Smyrna merchants exported 19 centuries later. 3,000 years of the same technique without fundamental variation is an argument in favor of the original solution's effectiveness. The dried fig cake did not improve with innovation because it was already almost perfect. Nutritional composition studies of the dried fig explain this persistence. The dried fig has a higher potassium content than a banana. It contains calcium in concentrations comparable to those of many dairy products. It has significant amounts of iron, magnesium, zinc, and phosphorus. It is one of the few plant-based sources of calcium consumed on a massive scale throughout history, with implications for bone health in populations that, in many historical periods, had limited access to dairy products. The dried fig was not just sweet. It was dense in micronutrients in a way ancient Mediterranean populations intuited without being able to articulate, and which modern nutritional composition tables confirm. The California fig crisis of the late decades of the 19th century is one of the most instructive episodes in agricultural history regarding the difference between knowledge and understanding. In the 70s and 80s of that century, California farmers had established plantations of thousands of acres of the Smyrna variety, convinced they would produce an industry comparable to the Turkish one. The plantations thrived, and the trees grew well, but at the moment the figs were supposed to ripen, they fell to the ground, green and unusable. The farmers had brought the Smyrna variety without bringing the knowledge of Caprification and without bringing the wasp that made it work. They called in experts who also did not know the cause of the problem. For 20 years, dozens of theories were proposed: the soil, the water, the nighttime temperatures, and dozens of remedies were tried. The plantations continued without producing. In 1888, a California entomologist read the texts of Theophrastus and recognized in them what the Californian farmers were observing: the need for the wild fig tree, for the cultivated figs to ripen. But the exact cause, the wasp, was not clear in the Greek texts. In 1899, the entomologist Albert Gage traveled to Turkey. He brought back wild fig tree material with Blastophaga wasps inside, hidden among harmless materials to pass port controls. The wasps, once released in the Californian fig fields, found the cultivated figs and pollinated them. The farmers who, in the following season, carried out caprification with material containing the Turkish wasps, saw their figs ripen for the first time. What Theophrastus had observed without understanding the cause was rediscovered in California through his own texts and the fieldwork of an entomologist. Aegean farmers had known it for millennia without being able to explain it. The cycle was completed. The fig tree is the tree that unites the earliest agriculture with the oldest biology on Earth. The Gilgal 1 fig, deposited in the earth 11,400 years ago, is the first evidence that a human being deliberately took a plant from nature to perpetuate a characteristic they liked. That decision began something we call agriculture. which since then has changed the world more profoundly than any other technology. The wasp that carried pollen from the first cultivated fig tree of Gilgal to the neighboring trees was acting with the same logic it had developed in 75 million years of coevolution. It didn't know it was participating in the birth of agriculture. It was simply looking for the place to lay its eggs, as its ancestors had done for millions of years before any human being existed on Earth. The relationship between the fig tree and the wasp began tens of millions of years before any civilization existed. It persisted through all empires, all sacred texts, all lawmakers, and all generals who used the fig as an argument. It still persists today. The fig we eat today is the result of 11,000 years of human selection on a plant that already had millions of years of history when we found it. Inside every fig are still the enzymatically digested remains of the wasp that pollinated it. The oldest relationship we participate in when we eat a fig is not with the Gilgal farmers, nor with the Greek philosophers, nor with the Roman generals, nor with the Ottoman merchants. It is with a blind, wingless insect that was born and died inside that closed pouch, without knowing that what it was doing connected the Cretaceous period to this morning's breakfast. The history of ancient medicine deserves its own chapter. Although ancient medical texts treat it with a mix of respect and distrust reflecting its ambiguous position between food and medicine. Hippocrates recommended the fig for multiple conditions, including fever, intestinal inflammations, and respiratory problems. Galen, the Roman physician who systematized ancient medicine in the 2nd century of our era, dedicated a detailed analysis to the fig in his theory of medicinal foods. For Galen, the ripe fig was hot and moist in the terms of the humoral medicine he codified, and therefore beneficial for dry and cold constitutions, but potentially harmful for those already hot and moist. The dehydrated fig was in his system hotter and less moist than the fresh one, and therefore more stimulating, but also more susceptible to producing excess bile. These categories of analysis are foreign to modern medicine, but the empirical observation that supported them was not incorrect. The fig contains ficane, a proteolytic enzyme that facilitates digestion, explaining the traditional association between the fig and gastrointestinal problems. It also contains phenolic compounds with anti-inflammatory properties, and the fig tree's latex has irritating properties upon skin contact. This explains both its traditional use as a topical treatment for warts and the warnings of medical texts against consuming unripe figs. Medieval European medicine combined the legacy of Hippocrates and Galen with the Arabic tradition that Ibn Sina, Avicenna in Western Latinization, had systematized in the canon of medicine. In the 11th century, Ibn Sina dedicated a section to the fig, adding his own observations on boiling its leaves for skin conditions and on the nutritional value of dried figs for convalescence. The canon of medicine was a reference text in European medical schools until the 10th century, which means that Ibn Sina's analysis of the fig circulated in European academic medicine for 6 centuries. The religious and medical dimensions of the fig converge in an episode from the 2nd Book of Kings that biblical exegetes have commented on with fascination for centuries. The prophet Isaiah, attending to King Hezekiah, who was dying of a severe infection, orders a poultice of dried figs to be applied to the king's sore. The sore heals. The episode is interpreted as a miracle. Doctors who have read it point out that the fig's documented antibacterial properties may have had a real therapeutic effect on the king's infection. Whether it was the prophet or the fig's properties that cured Hezekiah is a question that, strictly speaking, cannot be answered with the available data. What can be said is that the treatment did not lack medical logic. The fig was also the subject of the first documented descriptions of an agricultural pest in Western history. The biblical texts repeatedly mention locusts as destroyers of fig trees and vines. Theophrastus describes a disease of fig trees that causes drying of branches and premature fruit drop. Pliny mentions the aphid as a pest of the fig and recommends remedies based on the application of ash and animal urine. These remedies are direct antecedents of modern plant health. That they were documented as early as the 1st century for fig cultivation reflects the tree's centrality in the ancient agricultural economy. There is a final aspect of the fig's history that rarely appears in standard accounts and connects all the previous dimensions in a single thread. It was the first crop in human history, the first sacred food of the major monotheistic religions, the tree under which Rome was founded, the subject of the first documented commercial law, the instrument of the first Western economic sanction, and the argument with which Scipio convinced the Senate to destroy Carthage. This accumulation of firsts in the history of a single food is no accident. It reflects the real centrality of the fig in the first 5,000 years of civilization in the Mediterranean basin. The reason the fig accumulated this historical weight is biological. It is the easiest crop to establish in Mediterranean conditions, the one producing fruit with less investment than any other fruit species, providing predictable sugars in seasons of scarcity, and capable of being preserved by dehydration for years. This combination created the context in which the fig became an object of law, worship, and political argument. Only foods that everyone knows and on whose absence everyone would depend carry that kind of weight. The fig that Albert Gage introduced to California in 1899 through the Turkish wasp closed a cycle that had begun 11,000 years earlier in the Jordan Valley. The first farmer of Gilgal chose a tree that produced seedless figs. His successors propagated it throughout the Mediterranean. The Greeks legislated it, the Romans mythologized it, the Arabs sanctified it. The Ottoman merchants globalized it. When that variety reached California without its wasp and failed for 20 years, the solution was to return to Theophrastus's text. Written 20 centuries earlier, it contained the key that Mediterranean farmers had applied without understanding. The history of the fig is also the history of how knowledge, once acquired, does not easily disappear. It sleeps in the texts, waits in the gardens, and resurfaces when someone needs it.